I didn't plan to notice her that night, not really. I'd been leaning against the counter of the bookstore where I worked, fingering a stack of overdue magazines, pretending to be busy. She walked in the way she always did, confident, deliberate, like she owned the air around her without needing to speak a word. My mom had warned me not to get distracted, though I wasn't sure if she ever imagined this kind of distraction. Her heels clicked softly on the wooden floor, a rhythm that seemed to slow everything else down. She carried her coat over one arm, and her bag swung lightly against her hip, brushing against her jeans. There was a faint scent, lavender mixed with something sharp, almost like the edges of old paper and new perfume. She smiled at me, briefly, that kind of smile that felt familiar but unreadable, like a secret half-remembered. I cleared my throat and muttered a hello, fumbling over my words. She tilted her head slightly, watching me with a patience I wasn't used to. Most adults didn't look at me that way. They either saw me as too young or not serious enough. But she just looked. Her eyes were steady, warm, and slightly amused, like she was watching a puzzle unfold. "I didn't think you'd be working tonight," she said, leaning just a little on the counter. Her voice had that soft, smoky quality, the kind that makes you lean in a fraction closer, even when you know it's inappropriate. Yeah, just finishing some restocking," I said, and then realized I was holding a magazine upside down. She laughed quietly, a low, melodic sound that made my chest tighten. Not teasing, just acknowledging. Like she saw the mistake and didn't mind. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving, just existing in the same small space. The clock ticked too loudly in my ears, or maybe it was just me noticing it for the first time. My fingers brushed against the edge of the counter, and for an instant, I imagined hers brushing mine, but I shoved the thought away. "Do you want some coffee?" she asked, and I blinked. "I know it's late, but I keep forgetting my thermos. Yours smells better than the break room one." I nodded, fumbling with the machine like a nervous idiot. She leaned closer than necessary to stir her drink, and the heat from her shoulder brushed my arm. My stomach flipped, and I had to look away. Not because I was embarrassed, exactly, but because she didn't feel like someone I should be noticing like this, and yet I couldn't not notice. She picked up her cup and held it in both hands, looking out the window at the rain beginning to drizzle against the glass. The bookstore smelled like old paper, coffee, and a faint trace of her perfume, and suddenly it felt impossibly small. "Thanks," she said quietly, turning back to me. And just like that, just a glance, just a tilt of her head, my thoughts slipped. I couldn't stop noticing the curve of her smile, the way her eyes crinkled when she tried to hide it, the small, easy confidence that made the room shrink around her. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. So I just nodded, trying to appear casual, while my mind replayed that one soft glance over and over. And then she pulled her coat tighter, adjusted her bag, and left. But I swear, the moment her hand brushed the counter as she passed, just a whisper of contact, it lingered longer than it had any right to. I couldn't stop thinking about it. A week later, I found myself in her apartment, helping her rearrange a stack of books she insisted didn't belong on the shelf she'd carefully curated. The place smelled faintly of vanilla and old wood, the kind of smell that felt like it held memories in every corner. She moved around like she'd done this 100 times before, but there was a tension in her shoulders I hadn't noticed before. I tried to stay out of her way, handing her the books she asked for, but she kept glancing at me with that same unreadable expression. She wasn't unkind, not at all, just cautious, like she was measuring how much of herself to let me see. And somehow, I couldn't stop noticing. The curve of her fingers as she tucked a book into place, the faint tremor in her hands when she reached too far, the small sigh she let out when a stack fell over. "Sorry," she muttered, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Her voice cracked just slightly on the last syllable, a sound so small I almost didn't hear it. "It's fine," I said quickly, trying to sound casual. My chest was tight, though, watching her frown slightly at herself. There was a softness there, a vulnerability she didn't often let anyone see, and it made me hesitate, made me want to reach out and steady the stack of books for her, but I didn't. She leaned back against the wall, stretching her arms over her head. Her blouse rode up a little, exposing the curve of her waist, and I had to remind myself to blink and look away. She caught my gaze anyway, but instead of teasing, she just smiled faintly, almost apologetically, like she knew the effect she had and wasn't sure how to manage it. I noticed the faint shadows under her eyes, the little crease at the corner of her mouth that deepened whenever she laughed. A soft, genuine laugh that filled the space around us, though she tried to keep it contained. It was a small laugh, almost reluctant, like she was afraid of letting herself enjoy it too much. "Do you want some water?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual, as if speaking louder might break the fragile bubble around us. She shook her head, brushing past me with a careful grace, her hand grazing mine for just a fraction of a second. That tiny contact lingered longer than it should have. My skin tingled in the aftermath, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. She didn't notice, or pretended not to, but I could feel the weight of unspoken things pressing against us. The room felt smaller, more charged, like every book on the shelf was a witness. "Thanks for helping," she murmured finally, her voice almost swallowed by the quiet. And when our eyes met again, I swear the space between us seemed to hum. She turned to pick up another stack of books, but I stayed frozen, my mind replaying the moment her hand had brushed mine, the way her laugh had caught slightly, the softness behind her careful composure. And then, just like that, the moment passed, but I could still feel it lingering in the air. It was past 9 when she called me over to help fix the flickering lamp in her living room. The rain was tapping insistently against the windows, a slow, steady rhythm that made the apartment feel both intimate and impossibly small. She held the lampshade in her hands, twisting it slightly, and I crouched beside her to adjust the wiring. Her fingers brushed mine for the briefest second, and I felt that familiar jolt, a tiny electric current that made me aware of every inch of her presence. I wanted to pull away, but I couldn't. Not yet. She didn't look at me, just hummed softly to herself, lips pressed in concentration. And I stayed there, close enough to feel her warmth, close enough to hear the subtle catch in her breath when the bulb finally lit. "Finally," she said, a soft exhale that sounded like relief, and something else I couldn't name. She smiled, just slightly, but it was enough to make my chest tighten. We stood awkwardly in the sudden glow of the lamp, and I realized how quiet the apartment had become. The storm outside made it feel like we were in a world cut off from everything else. I wanted to say something, anything, but my words tangled in my throat. She tilted her head toward me, and the space between us shrank just a fraction. Then her phone buzzed, sharp and intrusive, breaking the fragile tension. She glanced at it quickly, frowned, and answered. "Yeah, I'll call you tomorrow," she murmured, voice distant. I couldn't hear the other side, but I saw the subtle hardening in her posture, the way her eyes flickered to me once before she ended the call. X, or someone she wished she didn't have to deal with tonight. I felt the weight of her private life pressing against the quiet bubble we'd created, a reminder that this closeness was fleeting and forbidden in its own way. She leaned against the counter, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, and I noticed how tired she looked, the faint shadows under her eyes, the small slump in her shoulders. I wanted to reach out, to brush them away like they were mine to touch, but I stopped myself. "Do you want some tea?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual, but my hands shook slightly. She shook her head again, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, and I realized she wasn't ready to lower her guard. Not yet. The storm rattled the window pane, a sudden gust rattling the blinds. I took a careful step closer to stabilize it, and she didn't move back. Not immediately. My heart raced, aware of the closeness, aware of how easy it would be to lean in, just a little, but I didn't. I stopped myself at the last second, tracing the outline of her presence with my gaze instead. We froze, suspended in that near moment, her eyes catching mine, a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of something dangerously close, something neither of us could name. The room was silent except for the rain and the hum of the lamp, and for a heartbeat, it felt like nothing else existed. And then she stepped back. We sat across from each other on her couch, the rain still drumming lightly against the window. The lamp between us cast a soft circle of light, but it didn't seem to reach the space in the middle, this invisible gap that neither of us knew how to cross. I wanted to say something, anything, but words felt cheap compared to the weight of the silence. She stirred her tea slowly, watching the steam curl into the air, and I found myself memorizing the way her fingers wrapped around the cup, the faint tremble in her wrist. "Do you ever?" she began, her voice catching, then faltering. She looked down at the table, tracing the grain of the wood with the tip of her finger. "Do you ever wonder why we're like this?" I swallowed, feeling my throat tighten. "Like what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Like this," she said, finally meeting my eyes. And there it was, the unspoken thing we'd been circling for weeks. Her gaze wasn't accusing, just searching, vulnerable, in a way I hadn't seen before. The confident, controlled woman I'd admired for months now seemed small and uncertain, and it made my chest ache. "I don't know," I admitted. My hands were on my knees, gripping the fabric of my jeans as if that could steady me. I feel like I shouldn't, but I can't stop noticing you. And then, I feel guilty for noticing." She nodded slowly, like she understood more than she wanted to. "I feel the same. But it's wrong, isn't it? For so many reasons. And yet, here we are." She paused, her lips pressed together, and I could see the tension in her jaw, the flicker of shame and desire and confusion all tangled together. I wanted to reach across the table, just to touch her hand, but the thought of it made everything inside me catch. She wasn't mine to reach for, not like this. And yet, she wasn't a stranger either. The room grew quieter. The rain softened outside, but inside, the silence stretched long, heavy. We didn't speak for minutes that felt like hours, our eyes tracing each other's movements, reading everything in gestures, pauses, and the almost imperceptible tremor of her hands. Finally, she whispered, almost to herself, "What are we doing?" And I realized it wasn't a question for me. It wasn't even a question for her. It was a question for the air, for the space between us, for everything that had been building and growing without acknowledgement. I opened my mouth, then closed it. No words could answer that. Not tonight. Not ever, maybe. She leaned back slightly, staring past me, and I could see the fight in her, the struggle between self-control and the pull toward me. My heart ached with longing and frustration, the mix of desire and restraint pressing against my ribs. She finally looked at me again, her voice breaking softly, almost unbearably. "I don't want to ruin this. Or you. Or me. But I don't know how to stop noticing." I swallowed, helpless, because neither of us did. I found her sitting on the edge of her bed when I arrived that evening, a stack of old photographs spread across the blanket. The room smelled faintly of jasmine and something sharper, clean linen mixed with the faint tang of old paper. She didn't look up when I walked in, just kept tracing the edges of a photograph with her fingertip. "Who's that?" I asked quietly, nodding toward the photo of a younger version of her with a man I didn't recognize. She let out a soft sigh, finally lifting her gaze. Her eyes shimmered, not with anger or frustration, but something heavier, grief, maybe, or regret. "That was a long time ago," she said, voice low, almost fragile. "I thought I'd moved on, but sometimes memories don't follow the rules." I stayed silent, unsure if I should sit or just stand there, letting her unfold at her own pace. She handed me another photo, this one of a small, sunlit kitchen, 2 coffee cups on the table, the faint shadow of laughter lingering in the image. He left suddenly. Never said goodbye properly. It's been years, but I still feel it in small ways. When I see a cup of coffee, or a messy counter, or someone quietly noticing me. I hesitated, my fingers brushing against hers as I took the photo. I wanted to say something comforting, something clever, but all I could manage was, "I get that. I think I know what you mean." She smiled faintly, almost embarrassed by her own confession. "It's silly. You're young. You shouldn't have to hear this." "Doesn't matter," I said softly. "We all have ghosts. Maybe they just show up in different ways." She nodded, eyes glistening, and for a moment we just sat there, side by side. the room humming with memories she hadn't shared with anyone. Then she reached for an envelope tucked beneath the pile of photos. She hesitated before handing it to me. I was going to throw this out, but maybe you should see it. Inside was a folded letter, written in a hand I recognized instantly as her own from years ago. Words I hadn't read, feelings I hadn't known, regrets she'd carried quietly. My chest tightened as I read the lines aloud in my mind. Small confessions, a heartbreak she never voiced, a vulnerability she never let anyone touch. She watched me silently, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I don't know why I'm showing you this," she whispered, voice barely audible. "Maybe because I don't want to feel so alone in it anymore." I looked up at her, and suddenly everything shifted. The subtle, slow-burning tension we'd been dancing around didn't vanish, it deepened. There was no overt declaration, no grand gesture, just the raw honesty of someone trusting you with a piece of their past. I wanted to reach for her hand again, to reassure her, but instead I just nodded. Let her know, silently, that she wasn't alone. She leaned back slightly, eyes soft but distant, and for a heartbeat, the room felt suspended. I could feel the quiet seismic tremor between us, the kind that doesn't shout but shakes everything nonetheless. And then she let out a long breath, small and fragile, and I realized I'd been holding mine the entire time. We sat on her balcony that evening, the city lights spilling into the room in fractured patterns across the floor. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy with lingering humidity, soft against our skin. Neither of us spoke at first. Words had become unnecessary. I noticed the way she folded her hands in her lap, the slight tremor in her fingers that always appeared when she was trying not to feel too much. She caught me staring, and for a moment, her mouth quirked in that half-smile that carried 1,000 things she didn't say. I wanted to lean closer, to close the tiny distance between us, but I waited, because I knew she would decide when it was right. Finally, she exhaled, long and quiet. "I don't think we can pretend anymore," she said softly, almost to herself. Her eyes held mine, steady and unflinching. Not that I ever tried to, exactly, but I can't ignore it. And I don't think you can either. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I can't," I admitted. Not a grand confession, not a declaration of love, just the simple truth that had been growing inside me for weeks, months even. She didn't need words. She already knew. We shifted closer on the balcony bench, the space between us narrowing until our knees brushed. A small, ordinary touch, but it carried everything we'd been holding back. I rested my hand lightly against hers, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her fingers curl slightly against mine, tentative at first, then with quiet certainty. The city around us hummed with distant noise, but it felt like a different world. One where nothing mattered except the slow rhythm of breaths, the heat of our proximity, and the unspoken understanding that we'd arrived here together. Careful, hesitant, but inevitable. She leaned her head against my shoulder, and I felt the small weight of her trust, the gentle surrender that made everything fragile and real. Not perfect, not a storybook moment, just this. Shared space, quiet acknowledgement. Two people finally allowed to exist together without pretense. We didn't speak. There was no need. The subtle press of her hand against mine said what words could not. Every glance, every hesitant smile, every shared silence of the past weeks had led to this. Unspoken, earned, quietly complete. For a long moment, I thought about how much danger there had been in noticing her, in caring, in feeling this pull. And then I realized it didn't matter. The risk had already been worth it. Everything else, the age, the past, the expectations, felt small against this simple, patient certainty. She shifted slightly, letting her forehead rest against my shoulder, and I closed my eyes for a moment, committing the warmth of her presence to memory. No fireworks, no dramatic declarations. Just a soft, shared understanding that this was real, that we were real. And in that quiet, ordinary, perfect imperfection, I felt something shift in both of us. Something that had been waiting for the right moment. And for us, that moment had quietly, irreversibly arrived. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. She didn't either. We just stayed there. Sitting here now, months later, I still think about that night on her balcony. How quiet everything felt. How small gestures carried the weight of months we'd both kept hidden. It wasn't a fairy tale, and it wasn't easy, but it was real, and that mattered more than anything. I've learned that love doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes, it grows in the pauses between words, in the steady press of fingers against one another, in the patient space you give someone to trust you. With her, it was that slow, imperceptible pull, the way we discovered each other in increments, careful not to rush, careful not to break what we hadn't yet fully understood. She's changed too. I see it in her smile now, the one that lingers longer when she's with me, unguarded but not reckless. There's still confidence, still that quiet control, but now there's also surrender. Surrender to the knowledge that connection, real connection, is worth the risk. That being seen, truly, doesn't have to be terrifying. I've changed too. I've learned patience, learned to observe, to notice the small moments that matter more than grand gestures. I've learned that being present is sometimes the greatest act of love. And that desire, unspoken or deferred, can carry its own quiet intensity, one that makes every touch, every glance, profoundly significant. The story of US isn't about age or circumstance. It's about the spaces we inhabit between certainty and doubt, about the courage it takes to let someone in and the humility required to let them stay. It's about understanding that love isn't always loud, and it doesn't have to be. Sometimes, the most profound moments are the ones no one else sees, the ones that happen in quiet rooms, rainy nights, shared glances, and tentative touches. I remember the first photograph she showed me, the letter she hesitated to share, the small tremor in her hand when she finally leaned her head on my shoulder. Each memory is a thread in the fabric of who we are now, woven together with patience, tension, and an honesty that can't be faked. And now, when I think back, I don't feel guilt or confusion or restraint. I feel a kind of warmth I never expected, a deep appreciation for the slow-burning way we found each other. It's subtle, yes, but it's steady, real, human. We still sit together sometimes, hand in hand, watching rain tap against the windows or city lights flicker across the walls. And each time, I remember how fragile and electric it all was, how small acts and quiet moments shaped something lasting. That's what I carry with me. The patience, the noticing, the trust, and the quiet understanding that some connections are worth every hesitant step it takes to reach them. If this story made you feel something, let me know in the comments. Would you want more stories like this?